Okay, this video is focusing in on factoring by grouping. So you can take your notes directly on your worksheet for today, and then we'll fill in the vocab sheet when we come into class tomorrow. But this is another factoring technique called factoring by grouping. And this technique of by grouping can only be used when you have 4 terms. So we're not going to factor by grouping if we have, like up here, a trinomial. And the idea of factoring by grouping means we're going to make even groups of 2. So it would make sense that we'd only need 4 terms. But this is what we're going to do. When we have 4 terms, we first can go through and look to see if there's a greatest common factor with all of them. And as you can see, 3 and 8 don't have a GCF, so we can't just, this is unfactorable if we only look for a GCF. So what we do instead is we break this apart mentally into 2 separate problems. And we look at the first 2 terms and we ask ourselves, is there a GCF between 2x cubed and 8x squared? Well, hopefully you recognize that there's a 2x squared as a GCF of this binomial. So when we divide 2x cubed by 2x squared, we're left with x plus, and when we do 8x squared divided by 2x squared, we get 4. Okay. Then we continue on with the problem. We bring this plus sign down, and now we factor by grouping here. So we look at what does 3x plus 12 have in common. There's a GCF of 3. And when we divide 3x by 3, we're left with x plus 12 divided by 3 is 4. So by factoring by grouping, our problem then ends up looking like what we did in 9 and 10. So now notice that we're exactly where we were before. We have this term and this term that have a GCF of x plus 4. So we pull that x plus 4 out front. And when we divide this whole term by x plus 4 cancels, and we're left with 2x squared plus 3. One of the biggest mistakes kids make is when we're factoring by grouping, when we group it into 2 parts, we bring this plus down. But then from this step to this step, when we factor out the x plus 4, there's no longer an addition here. That's a multiplication symbol. And now we factor that. Okay, so let's go to 13. So to factor this by grouping, 10d squared minus 6d, it looks like that has a common factor of 2d. And when we divide 10d squared by 2d, we're left with 5d minus 3. We'd bring down the plus sign. And 35d and negative 21 have a common factor of 7. So when we divide 35d by 7, we are left with 5d minus 3. So now we're just where we were at the last point. We have a GCF of 5d minus 3. And we're left with 2d plus 7. And we're finished. Okay, we'll do one more together. That's 15. So we factor by grouping. We look at these 2 things. It looks like there's a 5b cubed that we can factor out as our GCF. So when we take a 5b cubed out of 5b to the 4th, we're left with b minus 15b cubed divided by 5b cubed is just 3. Okay, so we want to keep in mind that we want to eventually have a term over here that we factor out that's b minus 3. Well, notice that 3 minus b, they really don't have anything in common. There's a 1. But notice that if we brought down this plus sign and we just wrote this as 1 and then 3 minus b, these two terms aren't quite exact. This is a positive b and a negative 3. This is a positive 3 and a negative b. So what could we pull out of here to make each of these things opposite? Well, if we made this a negative 1, negative 1 times what gives us positive 3? Doesn't that have to be negative? And negative 1 times what gives us negative b? So in essence, we pulled out, or we factored out, a negative 1 so that it turned each of these things opposite. Negative 3 and positive b. What's the reason? Now, this term, b minus 3, is the same as negative 3 plus b. They're just flip-flopped order. So now our GCF is b minus 3. And what we're left with is 5b cubed minus 1. Okay, I'd like you to continue on trying this factoring by grouping on both sides so that you complete all of the worksheet front and back. And we'll see you tomorrow.